Well, hi everybody, hi everyone, to our symposium of this evening, scenarios of the end of the Russian-Ukrainian war and the impact of each scenario on the world. Our speakers today will be Professor Alexander and Professor Richard Anderson. Professor Richard Anderson used to be CIA officer, principally in the analysis of international affairs, and he's one of people working during 17th and 18th very closely to the Soviet Union American relations through his work in the CIA. And Professor Alexander Etkind, he's the chair of the Russian Studies and the European University Institute. Well, now, Professor Alexander, you can start. Then Professor Richard Anderson will have his time. The speech between 20 and 30 minutes, please. And then I will give short speech. Then we will take questions.
Okay, thanks a lot for organizing this conversation. It's you know, very illuminating to talk to Richard with his illustrious biography. Hopefully that's the first time that I'm talking to a former CIA officer, though of course it could have happened without my knowledge in my past. All right, so you're asking about how this war could possibly end. I'm a historian, so I will talk first about how it started and what kind of historical explanations do we have at this point. I should say that immediately that I don't think that our historical explanations are sufficient and that we really understand the causes and reasons of this war. But in fact, I think we understand its possible outcomes slightly better. There are, explanations that are given by my colleagues historians and also by my peer sociologists and political scientists. They are mostly of a kind of culturalist, spiritualist, and ideological nature. Some experts underline Russian imperialist ideology, which Russia did have, and it's pretty well known, the history of the Russian Empire, the expansionist intentions of the Bolsheviks to create a world revolution, the Soviet Union that somehow kind of contained the same ideology in its borders, but also was pretty much expansionist state. And of course, the so-called Russian Federation has huge internal problems of centrifugal nature, like the problems that are kind of disrupting it from inside out. The Chechen War of the early 90s was, of course, that brought Putin to power, was a major manifestation of those issues. And the huge popularity of Putin's regime after the occupation of Crimea in 2014 also exemplified this kind of this ideological charge. So Putin did occupy Crimea, and the Russian population did, in large numbers, in the atmosphere of relative freedom, relative to what's going on now, supported that according to sociological principle. There is an idea of resentment that Russia has somehow suffered from the collapse of the Soviet Union, from the death of its empire, from the diminishing of its territorial domains. Resentment is a nice kind of Nietzschean term. I would rather call it revanchism. I think revanchism is a much better concept, much clearer and more direct word than resentment. Indeed, there is a lot of revanchist attitudes probably among Russian society, but definitely among the Russian ruling elite. And we see this ideological formation causing a major war right now. There is an idea of memory war, history politics. It's connected to this idea of resentment, or rather revanchism. Putin himself stated, just in the night of when he launched the invasion, he produced, or rather reproduced, because he had done it before, so more than once, pretty unrealistic picture of the Russo-Ukrainian relations in deep history, starting from the Kievan Rus and going all the way through the imperial period, 18th, 19th century, Catherine the Great, and Lenin, who allegedly presented Ukraine its independence, and then the Soviet Union, and then this idea of decommunization, which was also somehow the Nazification of Ukraine in the same time. It's for a historian, of course, it's really difficult to accept this, identification of communism with Nazism, decommunization with denazification. But he said that. He also said during that night that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. They belong to one and the same whole, which of course is very dubious nowadays, both for Ukrainians and for Russians, because clearly, there is nothing easier than to turn a friend into an enemy. If you just push your neighbor and he responds, you make him your enemy. So during the very first days, probably during the very first hours of the military invasion, Ukrainians did become the enemies of Russians. And there is a huge anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine right now. And of course, there is a huge anti-Ukrainian sentiment among Russians right now. But was it the cause of the war, or was it the outcome of the war? It's actually very difficult to disentangle these two questions. That's a challenge for the future historians and social scientists. But I'm absolutely sure that if you see these processes in their historical dynamism, you will see this nationalist attitudes on both sides. You will see the hatred growing and growing and growing with every day of the war. So if the idea was to to diminish, to suppress, to pacify this hostility, if this was the plan, no doubt it has failed. There is an interesting idea. I'm trying to make sense of it, to work on it as a historian. There is an interesting idea which is a classical idea. It actually was it was revived during the Balkan War of the middle 90s. The idea of the narcissism of minor differences. That was formulated in connection to the to understanding of the global history of genocide, and genocide that took took place during the Balkan War, say the Bosnian genocide in Srebrenica, 1992 and 1995. What does it mean? It means genocide, obviously, is a mass violence committed by one group of people to another group of people. These two groups, so there are always two groups. These two groups of people. They are not Martians. They are not, they are not from another planet. They are, both groups are humans. These two groups could be very different from one another or pretty similar to one another. One group commits genocide, meaning mass murder, destruction of culture and institutions done by intention, according to the definition of genocide. So one group does it for another group. So this idea, narcissism of minor differences, means that genocides usually take place between two very similar populations. Two populations that are really similar. They're still different. We're all different. But they are not that much different. If two peoples are very much different, that would result in, say, slavery or colonialism, exploitation, mass famine, robbing, things like that. But genocide, historically, happens between two pretty similar peoples. And for some reason, so there is, let's call it like the agent of genocide, those who are killing, and the object of genocide, those who target, those who would be killed. So they are similar. They are as similar as, say, there were the Nazi Germans and the German Jews who spoke the same language, were pretty much indistinguishable. The Nazi had to look at the circumcision basically for distinguishing a German Jew from a German. That took place between, say, Bosnian Muslims, between Bosnian Christians. Let's start from the agent, and Bosnian Muslims, who were, of course, different due to their different religions, but that was not the very late 20th century, the time of secularization. So how much different were these two religious groups when both were deeply secularized? And even the classical case of genocide that happened between the Turks and Armenians in the end of the World War I. Of course, those Christians and Muslims were more different then, but still they lived in the same area. They had very similar agricultural ways and traditions of doing things, of living their lives. They were neighbors for centuries, and then genocide happened. So this is what actually what's going on, I think, between Russians and Ukrainians right now. Indeed, Putin is right about that. Indeed, pretty similar ethnic and cultural groups, they clash. One group, and now I mean the Russian army, the Russian state, the Russian regime, the Kremlin regime, is committing or attempting to commit a genocide against a very similar ethnic and cultural and national group. And the Ukrainians resist as much as they could, and they fight vigorously, as we see that. Well, what are other reasons for the war? Psychic issues. There are so many allegations about poor health of the Russian president. Just today, if you follow the Russian news, maybe Richard does, one of the emigre Russian-speaking outlets called Project has published a really huge dossier, a huge account of the medical condition of Mr. Putin, and they have followed the doctors, medical doctors who are visiting him in Sochi and elsewhere, and there are all kinds of new medical issues that we didn't know about that Mr. Putin suffers from. But I don't really take it seriously as the explanation for the war. Mr. Putin is, a remarkable individual, very gifted. He is probably as gifted in his business of security, surveillance, secret service, as say Napoleon was in his business, and he's very gifted. He's very efficient. But I don't take it seriously that he could impose his psychic issues onto his narrow circle and on the Russian army and etc. on the security services. There is something that actually consolidates them, that manifests the common interest, and that turns this common interest into hostilities, into a major war in Europe. All right, and so from explanations of the past, we should turn to predictions of the future. This is our task, and of course, that's if we understand the past, so kind of with so much difficulty, of course, our predictions would be much poorer. So one of the ideas that I'm trying to share with you is that even though the reasons of this war are largely, how to put it, are largely historical, ideological, cultural, spiritual, psychological. So even though the reasons of the war belong to this sort of domain of ideas, the outcomes of the war will be much closer to the ground. They will be economical and ecological. And this is how we should understand that. So the economy, I think the economic side of this end game, and I don't know when this end game will happen. It visibly, it has there is a serious turning point of the war in military terms. Ukrainians are doing pretty well. I don't really see it as a decisive victory of the Ukrainians. It's a kind of, they have won a major battle. It doesn't mean that they are winning the war. The war could be, much longer and much more disastrous than what we have seen so far. But the economic blueprint of the Russian defeat is pretty clear. It's defined not on the battlefield, but defined by sanctions. And the sanctions are very successful and very consensual. Sanctions of the imposed by the White House, by the Congress, by the European Union, by individual nation states. Sanctions that are targeting the major sectors of the Russian economy. Very prominent oligarchs that really control a large part of the economy, banks, etc. So I really believe, even though the Russians who live there now, according to many reports, they don't really feel the pressure of the sanctions that much. They have not felt it so far. They are trying to continue their normal life, and this normal life does continue. But the sanctions are brutal, and they, I think, will, and they are making every day and every month, they will be making a major damage to the Russian economy. I don't believe that the Russian economy would survive it. I think if the war continues, then the sanctions continues. If the sanctions continues, the Russian economy and with it, the Russian state will collapse. We can discuss, and that's a very interesting discussion, what will happen next after the collapse of the Russian economy, the Russian economic governance, and the Russian political system. I have some ideas about that, but they are entirely kind of futuristic. But I'm eager to share. My current research interests are more like in the sphere of ecology rather than economics, ecological history, environmental history. And I'm really interested in thinking about the ecological, about the environmental outcomes of the war. And this is much less clear than economic outcomes of the war. So ecology and economy, those two eco systems of thought and ways of relating to life, they are clearly connected, but they're also very different. Of course, it's, what's going on right now in ecological terms is, horrifying. All these tanks are, there are estimates like up to 50,000 tanks and military vehicles operating now over there in Ukraine, both Russian and Ukrainians. Mostly Russians, minority of them are Ukrainians. They are, these tanks are huge emitters of CO2. They're huge emitters. Like the most favorable estimate that I could find online is that the relatively clean American Abrams, the emissions of an Abrams is equal to 10 big Mercedes cars. One Abrams equals to two. But I think it is very favorable, very sort of modest, very favorable estimate. It's actually, it's notoriously difficult to find the estimates of emissions produced by the military, by the American military, by the European military as well. And of course, we have no estimates about the Russian military, though it is reasonable to suspect that the emissions, like the emissions of T-72 are much, much, much high, maybe like, I don't know, 5 times higher than the emissions of Abrams. But of course, it's not only about emissions. There are so the Russian aircrafts, they ignited tens or many dozens of Ukrainian oil tanks and storages. It's all burning. Today, we saw in the news that the Ukrainians responded in kind and ignited the Russian oil tanks in Belgorod, which is on Russian territory. 8 oil tanks, huge things, lots of oil. It's all burning. It cannot be shut. This fire cannot be shut. It's major economic damage, but it's also a huge damage to our joint air, the air that we breathe, all of us, Americans, Australians, Norwegians, us, I'm talking from Italy, we all breathe the same air, which is being polluted by the war. Any war is a major polluter. This war, I think particularly so, because it's so kind of brutal and damaging to the industries and economies, and specifically to the supply of oil, gas, coal, and fossil fuel. Now, we all know that because of the war, the prices of fossil fuel are skyrocketing. Say, my university in Florence, where I teach, so they issue one order after another. So for the first order that they issued, that they would decrease the standard of the heating systems by 1 degree Celsius down. That was like maybe 2 weeks ago, to save gas, because Italy gets its gas, natural gas, mostly from Russia, And therefore, so prices are rocketing, prices are growing, and the university, along with many other, companies and institutions in Italy, they're trying to minimize the cost. So 1 degree lower. But today, it's still, it's 1st April. Still pretty cold actually here. So they are informing us that they stop heating. So there will be no more heating till the fall. So no more heating. So they are trying to save the gas because of the high price, not because of political reasons, not because they want to minimize the trade with Russia, but because they want to save money on the gas. Now, this huge, almost double increase of oil and gas prices that, unevenly it's fluctuating, and it's a very complex picture, but this huge increase of prices of fossil fuel that happened because of the war, because of the sanctions, because of basically an attempt to isolate a major supplier of oil and natural gas for the world. What is it? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Of course, it's a bad thing for for many consumers of energy worldwide. But if we're thinking about it in a slightly larger perspective, we're living in the age of Anthropocene. We are thinking daily, or at least before the war, we were thinking daily about climate change, about climate crisis. So the increase of oil and gas prices facilitate the energy transition. It becomes the turn to renewables easier, more realistic, and closer in time. The higher is every barrel of oil, the higher is the price of every barrel of oil or every unit of gas, the sooner we will get the energy transition. The more renewable energy will be in our energy mix. It's just as simple as that. The higher is the price, the sooner, the faster is the transition. Now, the faster is the transition, the worse is the economic situation for the energy suppliers, such as Russia. So they're benefiting, of course, from high prices in the very short term, but even in medium term, like just in terms of months or years, they are losing immensely. I understand very well the motivation of President Biden when he's trying to moderate this increase of oil prices by opening the reservoirs and trying to controlling this price, because it also causes inflation and damages his popularity. This is also very clear. But for us as humans, really, as living beings who live under the skies, the increase of fossil fuel prices is a good thing. The more expensive they are, the sooner we will get rid of all that. We will get rid of Mercedes-Benzes, we will get rid of T-72s, and of much else. That's the conclusion of my talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexander. Well, now we will move on to Professor Richard Anderson directly, and then I will take the speech after Professor Anderson. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mahmoud. There are several points Professor Etkind has made which are really important, especially this whole discussion of the ecological effects of the war. And it's true they drive up oil and gas prices, and that's strictly good. because it encourages us to get away from them faster. The other side of it is, of course, the extraordinary ecological damage. I mean, just the emissions from all this combat. Every time I see a television show of, some oil storage dump burning, I just wince because the emissions are enormous. The movement of military vehicles, the emissions are enormous. Fires, and the possibility of release of radiation from nuclear plants. All these things it's urgent to get this done as quickly as we can. That's a big problem, because typically the way wars end is an infantryman walks up to a commander of one side, points his rifle in his face, and says, you have two choices. You can order your soldiers to surrender, or you can die here. Either way, the war ends, because the commander doesn't give any more orders to fight the war if he's dead. And if he gives an order to stop fighting the war, it ends. Now, basically the way wars come to an end. That can't happen in Ukraine. Part of the reason is something I discovered at the CIA, and I can talk about it because it's been published. The report that I wrote, not with my name on it, is on the CIA website in a declassified version. It's a secret report using secret data, but it doesn't say very much about the data, so they have published it. It's called Morale and Discipline in the Soviet Armed Forces. And it tells you all this information we've had about the unwillingness of Russian soldiers to fight. Yes, this report was written in '76, and you might think that things have changed, but in fact, they've gotten worse. I wrote that report in '76 after a Soviet ship tried to sail to Sweden. In '79, I wrote another report, which I never finished because I left, '78, which predicted that the Russians would refrain from invading Afghanistan because they knew their army couldn't be trusted. That prediction, of course, was wrong, but that their army couldn't be trusted proved to be the case in Afghanistan, where the resistance to the Mujahideen resistance to the Russians was armed by Russian soldiers selling their rifles just to get food or to get drugs. So knowing the condition of their forces, the Soviet General Staff had actually told the Soviet Politburo, we can't win in in Afghanistan, pardon me, but the Politburo ordered them to do it anyway, which turned into the disaster we all saw. In '82, they tried to mobilize for an invasion of Poland, but the troops they tried to mobilize were Ukrainians, Balts, and Belarusians, and of course refused to be mobilized, so that invasion had to be withheld. In '91, the army tried a military coup, but the soldiers they sent into Moscow had no ammunition because the army knew that they couldn't trust them. So the coup collapsed immediately. In '93, I was present in Moscow at the time of a Nazi coup to try to oust Yeltsin. The army was ordered to invade there are two divisions constantly stationed near Moscow. Their commanders were ordered to enter the city and suppress the coup. They marched up to the ring road around the city and stopped. I had gone and joined a demonstration against the coup. It turned out the demonstration was being used to raise a militia. The organizer of the demonstration told me later that he'd gone out to the generals and said, either you enter the city or we have arms and we'll arm the militia in the morning and we will come and arrest you. And if you imagine, you can look at me on the screen, I don't look like Rambo. If you can imagine me threatening a Soviet army division, then you see how silly that is, except for the fact that the generals have been stealing the soldiers' food and they know their own soldiers won't defend them. So throughout this period, the crucial fact about Russia is that it does not have an army that will fight. And Putin did the same thing as the Soviet Politburo did in '79 in invading Afghanistan. He went ahead and sent in an army that he and his generals all knew wouldn't fight. Now, there are two parts of fighting. One of the part is the willingness of an infantryman to risk his life together with his fellow soldiers in contact with the enemy. And that's the thing that if the commanders are stealing your food, you won't do. So the Russian infantry won't fight. The other one is an artilleryman who's ordered to launch a rocket or fire a cannon and is way behind the lines. He's 30 miles from the target. He can't see it. He's not in any danger of retaliation unless it's, he's up against the US Army and it can do counter battery fire or send in A-10s and attack his cannon. So he's perfectly willing to load the cannon or launch the rocket and have it land somewhere. And the problem is that where that rocket or artillery round lands depends on having a forward observer who's willing to risk his life spotting for you. And if you can't do that, the Russian claims that they aren't targeting civilian targets are sort of true. They're not targeting anything. They're just firing rockets and artillery pieces at cities. And since they don't know where the rounds are going to land, of course, they hit a bunch of civilian targets. Now, that kind of irresponsibility is still a war crime. We need to be clear on that. It's vicious, but there's a reason the Russian army fights that way. And the reason is they don't have any infantry. So no Russian infantryman is going to walk up to President Zelensky, point a rifle in his face and order him to surrender. Can't end the war from the Russian side. You can't do that to Putin either. The Americans have been massively irresponsible in this war. They knew the Russians were preparing. They should have started deploying American armored brigades to Poland. They should have gone to the Ukrainians and to the Russians and says, if you enter to the Russians, if the Russians enter Ukraine, we will enter from the West and we fight the Russians. The United States Army does have a fight, the United States does have an army that's capable of fighting. I was a participant in the years I worked for the US Congress, although I wasn't in a position to do anything, but I was part of a group that taught the American army to fight. And the reason the Ukrainians are being so successful is because they had American trainers who probably taught them how to fight too. Right? You see the Ukrainians making these sacrifices that the Russians won't make. And of course, if one side is willing to fight and the other one isn't, this side that's not willing to fight gets slaughtered. And in fact, the Russians have taken these really heavy casualties because the Ukrainians will fight and the Russians won't. You notice on the television, there's been this story about this woman who's a lieutenant in the Ukrainian army, and she uses these shoulder-mounted missiles against tanks. Okay, that's the decisive thing. If Ukrainian women are pleading to fight, then there's nothing the Russians can do. The Ukrainian army just got twice as big. And now the other lesson of all this situation that affects the war, the long run effect is all of a sudden, for the first time since 1918, infantrymen apparently have a weapon that will work against tanks, or in her case, infantry women. Right? Infantry can defend themselves against tanks. They've been unable to do that since the British offensive in 1918, and especially during World War II and the Korean War and all these things. If you could, attacking tanks with tanks the way the Germans did at Kursk, it's an even fight. Attacking infantry with tanks, the tank had just an outright advantage because the infantrymen couldn't carry anything. The American bazookas in World War II would simply bounce off the German tanks without doing any harm. But these new missiles, especially the British NLAW, and to some extent, maybe the American Javelin, can destroy armored vehicles. And at that point, the capability for offensive war that's been so important has been the presence of tank forces operating together with infantry, mobile infantry. And that's apparently gone. So this war can't come to an end in the normal way. And the question is, how can it be brought to an end? Well, there's no reason for Putin to end it. Despite the disaster, it's redounding to its benefit. One thing that Alexander didn't mention, which was very prominent in the research I did for that CIA report, is the utter contempt that Russians feel for Ukrainians. There's a Mongol word in Russian, which refers to a top knot that was worn by Mongol warriors when they invaded Russia 800 years ago, right? Or 700, about 800 years ago. And that was picked up by the Cossacks, who were the original Russian-speaking population, or Slavic dialect-speaking population of what's now Eastern Ukraine. And in that famous picture of the Zaporozhye Cossacks, one of the characters is wearing this top knot. Well, in the Russian army, or in the Soviet army, the majority Russian soldiers would refer to the Ukrainian draftees as hochli, as this, the top knots, in this negative, almost, they're not different races, but the almost racist way, not in bigoted way. And so when Russians hear that Ukrainians are getting blown up, there's a substantial portion of the Russian population that's happy. So what's going on in Russia is Putin sees this as an opportunity to gain popularity. It's just a poll showing that his approval rating, which generally hovers around 60%, is 80% again. And that poll, those polls are meaningful. It may not be an accurate measure. People may not approve of him very much, but basically, this war is widely popular in Russia. And the reason for it is clear, that Putin from the beginning has promised to be Russia's protector. And that has been a meaningful promise in Russia, because from 1991 on, Russia's been in a situation where they lost half their population and a third of their territory. So when that happens to your country, people get worried. And Putin is motivated by the fact that he can appeal to Russians, see, I'm defending you. The American sanctions, which are necessary, because we've just absolutely got to stop funding the Russian war machine, right? Those bombs and rockets and artillery shells and cannons that are killing Ukrainians were funded by oil and gas purchases in dollars and euros. And we just got to stop doing that, and sanctions are at least the beginning of doing that. But, how do you get to the end of the war? Well, you have to try to negotiate something, but Putin doesn't have to negotiate. And Zelensky doesn't have to negotiate either. So one thing, I thought this war would be over quick, because, the Russians really are running out of troops. Not that they ever had very many. The basic issue in world security has always been the Russian army is too small to accomplish anything. And we notice you take on what's basically an unarmed country, and you can't do it. And so one thing that Putin can do is just let it drag on indefinitely. Eventually, years from now, the Russians get tired of a losing war. They get tired of the sanctions. The sanctions have some kind of effect. But the other thing is, they can sit down and try to negotiate something, but the outcome of the negotiations is basically a frozen conflict in which the two sides, the Russians occupy parts of Ukraine, what they've got basically, and the Ukrainians, from time to time, they and the Ukrainians shoot each other. That's just a really difficult problem. And I think we're going to be facing this for quite a while to come.
Well, Richard, we still have time if you want to continue.
No, that's
Yeah,
basically what I wanted to say.
Well,
I might call your attention to, there is one other thing that's really important that Alexander said, that, you know, I was just overjoyed to hear this. You keep getting these people asking the question, what is Putin thinking? That's absolutely the wrong question. And for one thing, you can't possibly answer what's going on in somebody else's mind. The only thing you could do is analyze the situation that somebody's facing, and to look at, you know, how is he solving the problem that's presented to him by his situation? And Putin's like anybody else. He's got to stay in power. There are lots of people who would like to get rid of him and take his place. That doesn't mean they would necessarily act very differently from him, because the clear way, the thing that Putin has done since 1999 onward, and that Yeltsin tried to do before him, was, I'm the defender of Russia. And I'm the defender of a Russia which has shrunk dramatically. Those of us who are Americans and live in a big country, right? Or even Europeans who've been relying for a really long time on the American security guarantee. You know, it's important to live in a big country. That's why the Europeans have turned to the American security guarantee, because none of their countries are big enough, not even Germany. Germany got conquered, split in half, lost a third of its territory. That promise is what motivates this whole war, because it can say, see, there really is a danger. See, the Americans really do hate us. That's a successful strategy for him, as long as he prolongs the conflict.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. My speech will be somehow short, not that long, because I'll concentrate only on what is the end of this war, how that will be end. What can be the image of the end? In my opinion, there are 3 strong scenarios, and there is other 2 weak scenarios. Let's start with the weak scenarios, which we hope to stay weak. It's to end by usage of nuclear. In my opinion, this is weak scenario, to end with nuclear, because Putin is smarter than launching a third world war. A third world war will not be affordable by anyone, especially all nations now on the world, or most of nations, have mass destructive weapons. Maybe somehow Africans and most of Arabic countries, they do not have mass destructive weapons, but most of the nations in Asia and Europe and United States for sure, they have mass destructive weapon, nuclear weapon, atomic weapon, etc. So I think this is a weak scenario. The other weak scenario also is to end by general peace, I mean, or comprehensive agreement between President Vladimir Putin with both American President Biden and European leaders. In my opinion, also, this is a weak scenario. That will not happen, at least in the short time. Maybe on the long term, with big efforts can happen, but on short time, I don't think that can be possible to be happen. So the 3 strong scenarios will end, and their impacts on the world. I think the first and the strongest scenario, both Ukraine and Russia will find a compromise based on Russia to feel safe by non-existence of military base, foreign military base, neither nuclear weapon in Ukraine, as well as for sure Ukraine not to join the NATO. I think this is the strongest scenario which will happen. And that if it happens, it will be somehow a good compromise for both two sides. And the second scenario is the complete defeat of Russia. And in my opinion, also, this scenario is not that strong. Somehow moderate is the complete defeat to President Vladimir Putin to be completely defeated and to accept to return back the Crimea and to get out of the territories which he recognized as independent states. I find that scenario is somehow weak scenario. The third scenario is also weak scenario according to what's happening since more than 1 month and a half now. It's Russia to be able to evaluate the whole Ukraine, which became now somehow impossible. So the most impossible scenario, which I mentioned, that to find a compromise between President Zelensky and President Putin by accepting, which we call it the fait accompli, the actual situation as it is now, and Russian troops to get out based on these conditions, Ukraine not to join NATO, no nuclear, no foreign military bases, but the impacts of this scenario still catastrophic on the world, not only on Europe or United States, but it will be catastrophic, especially on third world countries, as long Russia still under sanctions. Because in case of this scenario, I don't think sanctions will be removed. I don't think the American side, neither the European side, will accept to reintegrate Russia easily again in the economic market, in the SWIFT system, which they got them out of. From these things, I don't think that will be very feasible quickly. The fact Russia, and that which we really need to understand, Russia, when we sanction Russia, somehow we sanction ourselves, because Russia is not only Mr. Vladimir Putin. Russia is the economic power, despite the weakness of its economy according to its military ability or political ability or strategical ability, but still have things that we need, the planet, not only us in Europe or in the United States, no, the planet needs. We need the bread, and the bread is based on Russia and Ukraine. The majority of bread of the world coming from Russia and Ukraine, because they have the land and the soil, which is good for this. So we need lots also of the energy we need. We cannot really keep these sanctions, in my opinion, without suffering. But I think politicians prefer to suffer while surrounding Vladimir Putin. So this scenario, in my opinion, we need to find a solution to make the Western decision makers satisfied of surrounding Putin. I mean, find a good result which they need from the Russian side. Meanwhile, not to cause and to make a catastrophe and a disaster on other countries, especially now in Africa. There is already big disasters because of the climate change. There is big disaster in their nutrition, especially there are starvations, etc., because of the climate change. If we add the disaster of their nutrition caused by sanctions on Russia and Ukraine, Russia, only Russia, that's not logic. So there must be somehow a solution to, in order to satisfy the Western politicians, which they look very angry and completely insisting to destroy Russia, while Russia cannot be completely destroyed. It can be weakened, as happened in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen when the administration of Ronald Reagan sent the Mujahideen and brought Mujahideen from Saudi Arabia to fight Soviet Union, can be weakened, yeah, but cannot be destroyed. It's an old nation. It's a very well-rooted nation. It has its own sources to exist. It has itself sources to exist and can renew and relieve its sources internally. So it can collapse partially, but not totally. We cannot really remove this nation, that which also our politicians in the West must understand. That's why we need to find real compromise. Otherwise, the weak scenarios, which I mentioned at the beginning, will come up to be the strong scenarios, especially the scenario of usage of mass destructive weapons. Again, most of the nations on the world now, on our planet, possess in their own, they have on their own possessions mass destructive weapons, atomic bombs, especially, and nuclear bombs. And all of us are aware of that. The Nuclear Agency of the United Nations, aware of that. So if there is a third war started, it will be really we will die out, or the majority of the human race will die out. It will be the most awful and horrible disaster on the to hit our planet ever since the beginning of the history. So we'll end with this part, and we will take some questions. We got the first question for you, Professor. This is for Professor Etkind. What are the chances that Putin being ousted in coup d'etat, and what that mean? What it would mean for Russia?
Difficult question, obviously. We're talking about the future, though this future could be like tomorrow or in a month from now, in a year from now. This is the war, so I think he couldn't be, kicked out from power. He could be more like, it's more reasonable to imagine that he would be poisoned, or he would somehow disappear. I mean, once again, the only evidence that we have comes from the past. So, like, how many Russian leaders, dictators were actually kept alive after they were sacked? Not many. I mean, Khrushchev is a remarkable example. But that was the time of peace. If you imagine the war going on, like the Caribbean crisis, like would lead to a major war, and Khrushchev would be sacked during the war, he would not survive that. That's basically my feeling. My feeling, of course, I cannot give you any proof of that. Now, what will happen if there is a sort of serious military or kind of ongoing chain of military defeats of the Russian army in Ukraine? This is already pretty shameful. Why is this shameful? Because it's so, I mean, defeats are not necessarily shameful, but this is very fast, very unexpected. It's a huge disappointment for all, military experts. Hopefully CIA knew it better than, say, the German intelligence, for instance, because the German intelligence seems to be giving the most kind of the wrongest predictions of the course of this war. The Baltic countries were doing pretty well because they are so much closer. I hope that the Polish intelligence knew the facts on the ground much better. But look, say I could imagine that Putin on the peak of the overall disappointment would be eager to take truly radical measures. Would it be a tactical nuclear or something something like that. That's really kind of, we don't know what it would be. But like if he would be really eager to escalate, once again, he could be crazy, but his circle, his environment, his people, we cannot assume that they are as crazy. We just cannot imagine that. It's not a contagious disease. If it is a disease, it is not contagious. I mean, all those ridiculous tables, they sort of allude to, the tables for at which Putin doesn't like receive foreign leaders, but also his own ministers. They sort of produce this idea that the disease in the Kremlin is contagious, but it is not. Meaning that, like, if Putin really presses a decision that his environment feels is detrimental, is suicidal, they would make another choice. They would remove him from power. Now, so I imagine it like this way. Then what will happen? I respectfully disagree with you, Mahmoud, that we cannot imagine a collapse of the Russian Federation. We cannot imagine Russian nation will definitely survive. It's a great nation, many millions of people, brilliant, very decent people, talented and hardworking, etc. But I could easily imagine a collapse of the state and de-federation. I think de-federating Russia would be a good thing for humanity. So that, say, the Caucasus, like Chechnya, some other Dagestans, they would create their own problematic statehoods. Tatarstan, Siberia, all the wealth of Russia comes from West Siberia. It's not wealth anymore. When the world would stop buying the Siberian oil and gas, it would, it would cause major problems. Jamming all this, like stopping all this oil and gas flow is a major technical and again an ecological issue. And of course, there would be a huge, huge and very quick impoverishment of all these regions, from Siberia to Tatarstan, which is another oil producing region, to the Caucasus, to Kaliningrad, to the so-called Kaliningrad region, the former Eastern Prussia. So the centrifugal tendencies over there are very, very serious. And they were moderated and contained by the wealth that came from certain points on the map located in West Siberia. With sanctions, this mechanism doesn't work anymore. There is only centrifugal tendencies, nothing centripetal, nothing integrating it. So the nation will survive. The federation, maybe not.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. Question for Richard, then there will be a question for me. Before the war, Russian-Ukrainian war, NATO seemed to be a dead organization. Has it changed now? And do you think relations between Europe and the United States will be developed in the military aspect? Go ahead, please, Richard.
That's a good question. The problem is that what people say is happening and what's happening are not the same. The White House and the president, of whom I'm a strong, enthusiastic supporter, don't misunderstand me. The White House and the president say that NATO is united as never before. Well, this is plainly not true. You know, they can't agree to cut off the Russian oil and gas. The British say we'll get it around to it by the end of the year. The Germans say we can't do it at all. You know, we haven't heard what some of the smaller countries, I mean, what does Slovakia do without the Russian gas supplies? Italy's, you know, been very concerned that the Russians are, Draghi, the prime minister, just promised that the Russian gas would continue flowing. So there's clearly a major point of dissension. Now, you know, as I was saying, the European countries, Europe is very fragmented, and, you know, it's tending to fragment more. It hasn't happened, but Catalonia wants to leave Spain. Scotland wants to leave the United Kingdom. You know, the Flanders wants to leave Belgium. Maybe Europe is getting even more fragmented than it already is. And so if you want to be secure, you've got to be a big country. There's John Mearsheimer at Chicago, who there's a very prescient article by him after in 2014, after maybe even before the annexation of Crimea, in Foreign Affairs, in which he says, you know, we've expanded NATO's commitments without expanding its military strength. And as we added allies, instead of increasing NATO's military forces so that we could defend all those allies, the US went from having 17 combat brigades stationed permanently in Europe at the beginning of, at the end of the Cold War, to, after NATO expansion, we had 2. You know, they've now added a 3rd. And when it's a paratroop brigade of all things. And in Poland, they were asked what they were there to do. They said to reassure and to deter. They're not there to fight. And you've got to, if you're going to have a big alliance, you've got to have big military forces. And the Europeans have refused to do that. The Americans have refused to do it. And you notice no meaningful additional American forces have been deployed, even with a war going on in Ukraine. So whether NATO is really managing to pull together, I mean, obviously temporarily they're getting a lot of cooperation and they're patching over the disagreements. But you know, the Americans promised proudly that they doubled the defense in the Baltic states. From 1 battalion to 2. You know, even the Russian army, you can't stop with 2 battalions. It just gets run right over. And so I think NATO's got long-term problems. It may be that if the Russians continue their aggression in Ukraine long enough, they'll resuscitate it. They've certainly brought it back together temporarily. Yeah, oh, one other point that I should make. I don't want to go on forever and answer this one question. You know, Donald Trump got 75 million votes. There's a lot of Americans who would just like to walk away from NATO. And events like this, I don't think, change their mind. It's the constraint on Biden's response. Biden's response would have been to start deploying American army divisions, but he didn't deploy any or only very small forces because that just, you know, getting involved in this war on the American side just wouldn't have much appeal to all these Trump voters. Biden looks in a lot of trouble in 22, and he looks in even more trouble in 24. Doesn't mean we'll get Trump back, but whatever Republican we do get in 24, I mean, the likelihood that his voters or her voters maybe will be more committed to NATO than they are now seems to me slight.
I agree with you. Well, the last question for me, it's somehow a very good question. It's addressed for me. do you think the Ukraine war will spell the end of globalization? And what does it mean for Egypt and the Middle East? Well, I think, in my opinion, the globalization ended the day US and British troops invaded Iraq in 2003. I think when former Prime Minister of UK with the former President George W. Bush took the decision to break and to destroy the international order, which existed since 1945, by destroying the international law and going out of all rules of international law by invading Iraq, especially the pretext of invading Iraq, of the invasion of Iraq at that time, was the mass destructive weapon, which Mr. Colin Powell announced his regret, but after killing more than 2 million human beings, unfortunately. And Madame Albright, who just passed away, mentioned later it was acceptable war. However, the globalization ended at that day, while Europe doesn't want to recognize the end of globalization because of the European dependency on the American security and the American protection. That's why in Europe we say, no, globalization still exists, while that's not true at all. When Iraq was invaded, the international law was hit strongly and was shaken strongly. China started lots of secret programs. We can smell its effects time to time. Not only China and Asia, also maybe other good friends of the United States, like Canada, like Brazil, somehow they started their own projects. When I talk about China, maybe our attention goes directly to the military projects, but not only that, China started to put a vision for itself far away of the globalization. Now, the World Trade Organization, for example, which was the sample of this globalization, with the World Bank, mostly they did not work except in Africa and in some poor Middle East countries, and they did not get extended to rich countries like Russia and other nations. The reason why globalization doesn't exist almost. Again, here in Europe, we prefer somehow not to cheat ourselves, but somehow to make ourselves sleepy when it comes to the globalization. And we say, no, there is globalization because we have full and complete independence when it comes to the protection, and we depend totally on the American side. For that reason, we pretend there is globalization. The second part of the question, what will be the effect of this war on the Middle East? Well, I think the Middle East, the dictatorship will get increased by this war, especially the administration of Biden gave a real green light before the war to the dictators of this area of the world. And President Biden gave lots of promises, especially on his Twitter account at that time, concerning dictators. How will he treat dictators? How will he reactivate the rules of human rights and international law, etc. While the truth, and he would end the war of Yemen, which is the worst humanitarian disaster on our planet since long years, according to the United Nations. And despite that, unfortunately, President Biden made the contrary of what he gave as promises during before elections. He made all the contrary reasons. And me, myself, I would not be surprised if I find Mohammed bin Salman. I do not expect that to happen, but I will not be surprised if I find Mohammed bin Salman received in the White House one day by President Biden, I will not be surprised at that, because the administration of Biden for the moment is too much pragmatic, but in my opinion, less knowledgeable of previous administrations which we used to see, especially in 18s and 19s. The actual administration has big knowledge problem, we can say that, and it's very clear of the way of treatment of lots of cases and lots of issues on the international level. But well, I will not be surprised again if the dictatorship in the Middle East get increased, because they have a green light, they have abilities, and they have, as we know, lots of money and sources on their hands, and there is no anyone to watch them, as the administration of Obama made in the first 6 years or 5 years of the presidency of President Obama, when he watched that, and that which caused the Arab Spring somehow, or helped at least for the Arab Spring to be launched, or people to launch the Arab Spring. So, but we do not know how the future will be in general, in total. If there is war, I don't wish at all the weak scenario to become strong scenario, which I was talking about in my first intervention. The usage of nuclear and the third war. We do not know how it will be the shape of the area of the Middle East, because in this area there is no real army, there is no real project for any state. There is no state. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, these are the biggest, for example, of the region. They do not have their own project. No one of them has its own project, like Iran, for example, or like Turkey. They are just, their regimes exist just to stay, not to planify and to govern a nation with a project. If people of this project leave, that will be their successors will continue, like Iranians, for example. No, the Arabic regime, especially in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt and all this region, in fact, the same. They stay there just to govern, not to planify for a nation, or they do not have any project. So we do not know how they will behave, but for sure they will not be actors on the international level, but their lands will be like the Second World War, will be a land of wars, like which happened in the Second World War between 39 and 45, when the lands of the Arabic Peninsula and Egypt was somehow land of war of elements, especially the German and British in the Second World War, and in the First World War, the Arabic Peninsula in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries now was the land of war between British or the Western side in the First World War here, and Turkish or Ottoman Empire troops at that time. So I think it will be the same. They will not be actors, only their lands and their sources will be used by the real fighters, by the real actors who are not from their lands. That's all for me. I will let you know if you need, if you still anyone want to say anything. Otherwise, we will end after you. Alexander, Richard, nothing, no comments.
I can tell you a story that you know very well. That's from the apocalypse. There were 4 horsemen prophesied there. The first was plague, the mass disease. The second was war. The third was hunger, famine. And this is what's coming. And the fourth one, which nobody remembers actually, but I Googled and learned what it is. That's called death. But I think death, I mean, it all comes, you know, to death. So I would propose to rename it into flood, like climate crisis, you know, brings floods. So that with this little correction, I think we are, you know, it all makes sense.
Maybe I will make one final comment.
Yeah, sure.
I think one of the things that is exaggerated in this situation is the likelihood that it's going to become a nuclear war. You know, Putin clearly wasn't deterred from invading Ukraine by the threat that it would escalate to a nuclear war. And he's talked a lot about, you know, escalating if anyone counter intervenes, but you notice that NATO has interfered with his invasion, and that's dried up. Because the problem is one that Alexander talked about earlier. Okay, so suppose Putin orders the strategic rocket, the former strategic rocket forces, now significantly renamed the forces of restraint. Suppose he orders them to launch a nuclear weapon. Do they obey? I mean, there are said to have been two cases when one where a Russian submarine captain, a Soviet submarine captain, ordered a nuclear strike on Miami during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the communist officer that was aboard every ship countermanded his order, so the strike was never launched. The other case is apparently the Norwegians launched a weather missile, which triggered the Soviet alarm system, and a colonel decided that he wouldn't forward the report that the alarm system had been triggered. I mean, in order to fire a nuclear weapon, you have to have a whole bunch of people cooperate in doing it. And any of them only has to think, oh my God, what if this leads to the total destruction of my country and of the United States and of Europe, and is afraid to go forward with it. So I think there's a built-in non-escalation. I think the United States could send military forces to Ukraine and fight the Russians, and as long as we didn't cross the border into Russia, there would be no nuclear exchange. Because the problem is anybody really willing to not have Russia anymore? Because that's where it goes. And so I think I've, you know, in '68, when I was in college and nuclear deterrence first became an issue, I read about it extensively, and finally I quit worrying, because the nuclear war is self-preventing and it stabilizes and limits the situation. But because it stabilizes and limits the situation in Ukraine, it doesn't offer us a way of ending the conflict there. And that, of course, is a big problem for all the reasons that Alexander talked about, and for the reasons I talked about. You know, how do you get out of this once it starts? Now, I agree with his answer about, does this lead to the ouster of Putin? Possibly it leads to his murder, but what does the guy who succeeds him do with that 80% approval rating that you get if you fight the war? This is a kind of a grim situation. I mean, the best we can hope for is that the Ukrainians and the Russians are able to sit down and work out some kind of an accord. I don't think that's much to hope for.
Well, just a quick comment, Richard. I don't think the United States is able physically to confront Russia, or not to confront Russia, to be engaged in a war. Because I think if there is a war, a new war, that United States launched any place over the world, I think Iran will launch a war in the Gulf at the same time, and meanwhile will support the enemy of the United States. In my opinion, Iranians accepted already that sanctions not to be taken off because of Russians, because the sanctions and negotiations in Vienna, well, they had already ended, everything agreed, except when it came the invasion of Russia and the getting out of the Russian from the SWIFT and these economic sanctions, the Russian said, well, we will not sign any agreement of the nuclear, the Iranian nuclear, except if you give us exception of the trade with Iran. And Iran accepted that, did not protest, by the way. Yeah, it looks like funny information. Iranians who have sanctions all these years and have been screaming all these years against sanctions suddenly accepted that, oh, our Russians are our friends, so fine, we will wait. We waited lots of years, we will wait more until we solve the problem of Russia. So whomever will be in front of the United States, Iran will take his side. This is one part. But the most dangerous part, Iran will not be late, in my opinion, to launch something in the region there. Iran started already. There is gas and petroleum area called Al-Durra. The Iranian officials announced, well, we share Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in this area, and we will start searching the gas and petroleum in this area because we share it. The Kuwaiti Minister of Foreign Affairs said, no, it belongs only for us and Saudi Arabia, and we already made all signatures for that, etc. Iran started to send tools to the area. That means, well, show me yourself. Okay, I'm here. And also some reports talking about military protection for the equipment which were sent. Despite I don't think at all Saudi Arabia would be enough courageous really to to harm any Iranian interest or to touch any Iranian interest or any Arabic countries in the Gulf. After Iraq, particularly Saddam Hussein regime, I would be surprised if any of actual regime would really confront Iran, would be enough courageous to confront Iran. So I think this is also in the mind of the decision maker in Washington, D.C. Any war, Iran will, because Iran really, I think, is the real nightmare of Washington, D.C. since end of 19th. Because China, the things will be solvable at the end. There will be solution for Taiwan. With Russia, there will be a solution for Ukraine. But with Iran, the United States is completely embezzled, doesn't know what to do with Iran particularly. Especially everything was experimented with Iran, like sanctions, like language of force, like strict language, and nothing could really make Iran to be that nice existence and that friendly state to others, unfortunately. However, thank you very much. Is there any comments now, or shall I be able to, can I end